Let's begin tonight, in a place where the air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. The year is 1692. Dawn is just beginning to stretch its fingers across a small colonial village, tucked into the New England forest. The sun rises slowly behind tall, bare-limbed trees. A rooster crows once, then again, somewhere in the distance. The icy breath of morning drifts from the mouths of early risers as they step out of timber-framed houses onto frozen soil. The path between homes isn't paved. It's a narrow, muddy lane, worn down by years of footfall, horseshoes, and wooden cartwheels. Smoke curls from chimneys made of river stone, drifting upward into the gray sky. Palibzad, a young boy in woolen stockings, runs toward the village square with a bundle of kindling strapped to his back. He passes a pair of women, setting out baskets of turnips, apples, and dried herbs on a wooden table. They do this every market day, not to sell for coins, but to trade, because in colonial America, money wasn't always money. Not in the way we think of it today. There were no credit cards, no neatly folded bills. Most colonists had never even seen a real British coin. Even if they had, it likely wouldn't have helped them much. Coins were rare, inconsistent, and often foreign. What mattered more was what you had, what you could make, grow, catch, sow, or trade. And what mattered most was whether someone else needed it. Tonight, we're going to walk softly through a world where a pound of tobacco might buy you a pair of boots, where a beaded belt held more authority than a silver shilling, where promises were inked on scraps of parchment and passed like sacred bonds from hand to hand. We'll linger by hearths and hear stories of people bartering salt for labor, fur for bread, nails for whiskey. We'll travel the trade routes of the indigenous people, whose beads and shells became colonial currency. And we'll listen to the clink of Spanish silver, the pirate's prize that became the backbone of commerce in a land that wasn't supposed to print its own coins. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's slow down. Let's imagine what life was like before dollars ruled the day, before price tags, receipts, and wire transfers, when money was a living, shifting thing, not something kept in a bank, but carried in a burlap sack, rolled in a tobacco leaf, scribbled in a ledger, or woven into a ceremonial belt. Money in colonial America wasn't just a thing. It was an agreement, a hope, a conversation between neighbors. It meant different things to different people, depending on the time, the place, and the desperation of the day. If your only horse went lame, you might pay the farrier with fresh eggs or a stack of hand-cut lumber. If you wanted schooling for your child, you might offer the schoolmaster a quilt. If the tailor didn't need a quilt, you'd need to find someone who did, and then find something they wanted. This web of exchange stitched the colonies together long before banks or dollar bills arrived to impose order on it all. And in that chaos, something beautiful lived, something human. Because the story of money in early America isn't just about economics. It's about survival, imagination, and trust. So tonight, we'll begin with the earliest days, when barter reigned supreme, and everything from muskrat pelts to chunks of iron had its price. We'll journey into the forest, where traders exchanged words and wampum with indigenous tribes. We'll step into the candlelit corners of makeshift mints, where colonists tried to forge a future in silver. And we'll watch the slow birth of paper money. Awkward, fragile, and deeply distrusted, yet destined to shape a nation. There's no need to rush. Let the stories unfold like smoke from a pipe curling into the evening air. You're not in the 21st century anymore. There are no streetlights here, no digital wallets, just flickering candles, barter boards, and the hush of trade whispered between neighbors. Let's begin with a question. If you couldn't use coins, what would you trade to buy your daily bread? The door swings open with a soft creak. You step inside a colonial general store. Not the kind with shelves stocked high with packaged goods, but something far simpler. The scent hits you first. Beeswax candles, musty burlap sacks, and dried herbs hung from wooden beams above your head. There's no cash register, no glass display cases, just wooden counters, barrels, bins, and the slow shuffle of boots on dusty floorboards. A farmer steps forward. He's sun-worn and stooped, hands cracked from years of plowing. He doesn't reach for coins. He lays down a bundle of brown, crumbling tobacco leaves tied with twine. The shopkeeper nods silently and hands him a packet of sewing needles and a small jar of molasses. No receipt is printed. The transaction is complete, carried out without money, in the way you know it. Next in line is a woman with a cloth sack over one shoulder. She opens it carefully, revealing 2 muskrat pelts, still soft and damp from the morning's trapline. She points to a block of salt and a pair of woolen socks. The shopkeeper rubs his chin. He agrees, but only if she throws in that jar of goose fat she mentioned last week. She smiles, nods once, and the deal is done. And behind her, a boy, no more than 10, waits quietly. He clutches a squat, waxy candle in his hands, handmade. The wick is crooked. He places it on the counter, his eyes drifting toward a clay marble sitting in a small wooden tray. The shopkeeper pauses, then smiles. "A fair trade," he says. You might think these scenes are fictional, romanticized. But this was real life in early America. Barter wasn't rare. It was daily survival. And in places where minted coins were as scarce as sugar in winter, people learned to make anything into money. The store wasn't a store. It was a marketplace of improvisation, a place where currency was defined not by kings or governments, but by needs, and sometimes by hope. A spool of thread might be worth a pound of flour on one day and worth nothing the next, depending on who was standing across the counter. There was no fixed exchange rate, no inflation charts, no central bank, just people and the things they had to offer. Some colonies tried to impose structure, to create lists and equivalencies, but life had other plans. In Massachusetts, tobacco became as good as silver. In Virginia, corn and deer hides were accepted in local courts. In New England, wampum was used to settle debts. And sometimes, the promise of a future favor or a scribbled note could stand in for hard goods, because everyone knew everyone, and debts didn't disappear. It was, in many ways, a world of trust, of relationships, of reputation. A blacksmith might extend credit to a farmer because he knew he'd be paid back in winter firewood. A tailor might fix a seam for free because last month the widow had helped his wife through childbirth. A baker might give out loaves on Sunday, knowing he'd be repaid in vegetables come harvest. And yet, beneath all this neighborly warmth, there were anxieties. What if the person never paid you back? What if the pelt was rotten? What if the salt was impure? What if you traded too little, or worse, too much? Without currency, there were no absolutes. Every trade was a negotiation, and every negotiation was shaped by circumstance, need, and the ever-shifting value of goods that decayed, spoiled, or changed hands again and again. The idea of value itself was unstable. Why was a muskrat pelt worth a pound of nails on Monday, but only half as much on Friday? Why did one man's hand-cut tobacco hold more weight than another's? And what made wampum beads sacred to one culture and trivial to another? In this world, money wasn't a number. It was a story, a context, a living agreement that evolved with every season, every storm, every shortage. And yet this strange economy worked. Somehow, it kept boots on feet, roofs over heads, grain in storage bins, and candles on every hearth. It stitched together a civilization before that civilization even had a flag, or a bank, or a currency of its own. Tonight, we'll trace that evolution from the earliest barters and native trade networks to the appearance of foreign coins and counterfeit colonial currency to the shaky birth of American paper money. We'll watch it unfold not from above, but from the ground, from the muddy boots of settlers, traders, women, farmers, and children who exchanged goods by necessity long before economics became a science. We'll pass through villages where the richest man in town had no gold, and through towns where a beaver pelt was more reliable than a British shilling. We'll follow the quiet logic of necessity and how it shaped a system unlike any other. So before we move on, pause a moment longer in the stillness of this store. Hear the creak of the beams, the jingle of the shop bell as the door closes behind someone, the murmur of a deal being struck, the clunk of a barrel lid being lifted, the rustle of dried herbs as a breeze slips in from outside. There is no money here, not in the way you know it, but everything, every item, every hand, every whispered deal is currency, not minted, not printed, but deeply, unmistakably human. Let's step into the boots of a settler. Not a wealthy landowner, not a politician or merchant, but an ordinary colonist. You're standing on the edge of a dirt path near your cabin, staring down at your last bundle of firewood. Winter's breath hasn't fully left the trees, and already the chill has settled back into the soil. You've got a roof over your head, but no lamp oil left. No sugar, no shoes thick enough to keep out the morning frost. And you have no money, not because you're poor, but because almost no one in your colony uses coins. So what do? You walk a mile into the village, with that bundle of firewood balanced on your shoulder. Oh, you know the cobbler has a wife who is sick and cold and needs warmth. You also know that he's got a spare pair of leather boots from last autumn, too small for most men, but perfect for your youngest boy. You offer him the firewood in exchange for the boots. He hesitates. Likes the wood, but he's been looking for onions and salted fish more than footwear lately. You nod, understanding. You don't press him, but before you go, you remind him. I've got dried beans and some garlic left at home. Good ones, kept dry. That seems to catch his interest. And just like that, the trade begins, not just of goods, but of memory and goodwill. By the time you return with the garlic, he's decided he'll throw in a bit of beeswax too. His wife has more than she needs, and she likes your family. No money changed hands. And yet, both of you walk away with what you need. Barter, in colonial America, was the economy of the everyday. It was messy, imprecise, and completely personal. No central authority standardized prices. No exchange rates existed. Everything was based on need, availability, and trust. People traded what they had and hoped to receive something they needed, or at least something someone else might want later. It wasn't a linear economy. It was more like a chain or a spiral. One trade led to another, and another, and another, until eventually someone ended up with the goods they truly needed. A cow might be traded for half a wagon's worth of lumber, a patch of wool for several loaves of bread. A dozen eggs might buy a haircut, or a prayer, or a page copied from a book. In remote areas, even knowledge could become currency. Stories, herbal remedies, local maps, hunting tricks. Children grew up watching their parents barter, learning the unspoken rules of value and scarcity. They learned when to offer more, when to walk away, when to sweeten the deal with a favor or a future promise. And when trust was broken, well, that was another kind of cost entirely. Of course, not all trade was spontaneous. Some items, over time, became known as valuable. Mullock, these were the unofficial currencies of early America. Not minted or certified, but deeply practical and widely accepted. Tobacco was perhaps the most famous. In Virginia especially, tobacco was more than a crop. It was a unit of account. You could pay taxes in it. You could buy land with it. You could even use it to pay off court fines. The colonial government set a value on it per pound, and for many years, it was more stable than coin. Corn held similar value in other colonies, particularly among frontier settlements. It fed people. It fed animals. It could be traded across cultures. In times of scarcity, a few sacks of cornmeal could sway a decision more effectively than silver. Nails, gunpowder, flint, beeswax, linen, and even salt. All of these items acted like pocket money. They could be stored, weighed, and divided. They had everyday use and lasting shelf life. In some places, iron tools became a kind of portable wealth. A hammer might buy more than a hand-woven blanket. And then there were the more unusual forms of value. Alcohol, for instance, often served as a medium of exchange. Rum was especially popular in the northern colonies. A dram here, a bottle there. It could settle small debts or smooth over sour business. Of course, it also led to more than a few bad deals made under foggy minds. Animal hides, especially beaver and deer, were a core currency on the frontier. Trappers and indigenous traders alike used them to obtain tools, weapons, and supplies. A well-tanned pelt might be worth a month's labor, or a musket if you knew the right buyer. Over time, certain commodities became so reliable in trade that colonial officials began listing their values in public notices, setting rough prices to stabilize local economies. But these efforts were always regional and always vulnerable to disruption. A failed harvest, a storm, a broken supply chain, any of these could upend the entire system. There were no vaults, no guarantees, just value, floating on the wind. Barter and commodity exchange weren't just economic, they were social. What hoth? You didn't just trade with anyone. You traded with neighbors, people you saw at church, people you relied on during winter, people whose children played with yours, and whose voices you knew from across a field. That familiarity was part of the system. If someone had a bad reputation, if they traded poorly, gave spoiled goods, or reneged on promises, word spread fast. Their credit evaporated. No one would deal with them. But if someone was generous, or consistent, or simply kind, they could trade far beyond the value of their goods. In small communities, this created a delicate balance of social capital. Wealth wasn't just what you had in your pantry. It was what people thought of you, what they expected you to deliver. A man with a good name might be loaned a barrel of flour during a famine, even without any promise of repayment, because he'd proven himself trustworthy. That was worth more than silver. At first glance, the barter system seems quaint, even charming. A loaf of bread for a pail of milk, a set of hand-sewn buttons in exchange for a wool cap. It evokes a sense of closeness, of a world where money is rooted in life itself. But beneath that simplicity lay real tension, because barter, for all its earthy logic, was deeply flawed. It required not just trust, it required coincidence. A mutual meeting of need and want, perfectly timed, and in a world where survival could hinge on a single trade, mismatches could be costly. Imagine for a moment that you're a tailor in Connecticut. You've got fine, warm cloaks stitched through the winter, each one dyed with precious imported indigo, but your pantry is empty. You need oats. Now, you head to the village hoping someone, anyone, will be in need of a cloak. But the miller's wife just finished her own batch of blankets. The cobbler has no use for new clothes. The baker, perhaps. But he's not sure the dye will hold in the rain. And besides, he prefers to trade for wood. You don't have wood. So now what? You're stuck. Not because your goods aren't valuable, but because the people around you don't need that value right now. You might try to make a multi-step trade. Swap the cloak for a barrel of nails from the blacksmith, then trade those nails to the baker for flour. But that means more time, more negotiations, more chances for the value to shift, or the deal to collapse. Barter, at its core, depends on double coincidence of wants, a clunky term for a common problem. Both parties must want what the other is offering, at the same moment, in the same place. And if they don't, the deal dies. This inefficiency rippled through colonial life in subtle ways. It slowed trade, it discouraged savings, it made long-distance commerce nearly impossible, and it placed enormous pressure on community memory. Everyone had to remember who owed what, to whom, and when it was supposed to be paid. Debts weren't always documented. Many were just spoken agreements, sealed with a handshake or a nod over cider. Some were recorded in homemade ledgers, little books tucked into coat pockets, or left near the hearth, ink fading with time. But many more lived only in the minds of those who kept score. And that, too, was dangerous. What if someone died before repaying a debt? What if a storm destroyed a promised crop? What if someone simply denied the agreement? In this way, the barter economy strained at the edges of trust. It was flexible, wonderfully so, but also fragile. The more complex the colony grew, the more settlers realized that this patchwork system, for all its homely charm, couldn't stretch forever. Barter also made people keenly aware of how value shifted like smoke in the air. A muskrat pelt might be valuable in winter, but nearly worthless in spring. A bundle of dried fish might be in high demand near the mountains, but not in coastal towns. Tobacco might fetch a fortune in one port and be traded like firewood in another. Even personal labor had no fixed rate. Eily, A skilled carpenter might build you a wagon wheel in exchange for a cow, or just for a keg of cider, depending on how thirsty he was. Everything depended on context, weather, scarcity, personality, even gossip. One traveler in the early 1700s described how in some towns you could trade a barrel of apples for a gun, but just 2 villages over, apples barely earned you a spool of thread. Why? Because the second town had more orchards. Imagine the mental effort required to constantly recalculate the value of every object you owned. A dozen eggs, a slab of beeswax, an extra pair of mittens. All of it was in constant flux. Barter was like navigating an invisible marketplace where the prices were always changing and no one could quite agree on the rules. It's no surprise then that as soon as a colony found a stand-in for money, something widely accepted, easy to store, and hard to fake, they clung to it. But even that brought its own problems, as we'll soon see. And then there were the IOUs. When barter failed, when no immediate trade could be made, colonists often resorted to promissory notes. These were handwritten pledges of value. One might read, "I, Samuel Carter, promise to deliver 3 cords of pine wood to Abigail Little before the first snowfall in exchange for 1 sack of barley. Signed this 5th day of September, 1703. These notes became unofficial currency, passed from hand to hand, traded like money. If Abigail didn't want the barley, she might give the note to someone who did, with the understanding that they would now collect on the wood. But it could get complicated. What if Samuel defaulted? What if he only delivered half the wood? What if he denied writing the note? There were few courts, and even fewer with the time to mediate small trades. And so, some promissory notes became ghost money, drifting through villages, unpaid, unsigned, unfulfilled. Still, these notes represented an early step toward abstraction. The idea that money didn't have to be physical. It could be a promise, a belief, a contract. And once colonists got a taste of that idea, the desire for something more stable, more standardized, began to grow. But that story is still ahead of us. For now, let's pause. You're back in your cabin. The trade has been made. Your child sleeps soundly in new boots. The fire crackles. The last of your garlic has been exchanged, but there's flour on the table and a jug of honeyed cider tucked beneath the bed. No coins, no paper, just trust, wood, time, and barter. Tomorrow, it will all begin again. Let us stay in the soft hush of that time, a little longer, before coins clinked in every pocket, and long before a printed bill came to mean anything more than a promise scribbled in ink. Because the beauty of barter wasn't in its theory, it lived in the stories, small and quiet stories passed down across dinner tables, in the backs of ledgers, and tucked between the folds of fading letters. It lived in the absurd, the clever, the unfair, and the deeply human acts of negotiation that shaped everyday life. Take, for example, the story of Jonas Tuttle, a cooper in a Massachusetts village near the Connecticut River. Jonas was known for making watertight barrels, smooth oak rings bound with hand-forged iron. In a land where salted fish, cider, and pickled cabbage needed storing, a good barrel was worth far more than its weight. Jonas was aging. His hands were beginning to tremble. Holy, his barrels were no longer perfect, but they held. One winter, he needed a new roof. Shingles were rotting, and a storm had peeled away the last of his thatch. He went to the local carpenter, a man named Ellis, and offered 4 of his remaining barrels in exchange for a new roof. Ellis hesitated. Jonas's barrels weren't what they used to be. But then Jonas offered one more thing, a promise to take on Ellis's son as an apprentice and teach him the trade, as long as his hands could manage it. Ellis agreed, and so a roof was traded for barrels, and a boy's education. No money, just tools, time, and legacy. Elsewhere, in a rural part of Pennsylvania, a woman named Annabelle Green once traded a dozen handmade candles, 2 skeins of wool yarn, and a recipe for gooseberry jam in return for a silver brooch she'd long admired in the hands of a visiting peddler. The peddler, a man from the coast who often carried trinkets and gossip between towns, had no use for candles or jam, but his wife, he said, adored gooseberries. And the yarn, it was fine, soft, strong, the kind she liked to use when knitting on long sea journeys. The deal was struck. Later, Annabelle would pass the brooch to her daughter on her wedding day. It became a family heirloom, all born not from coin or wealth, but from jam and wax and sheep's wool, spun by the fire. There were stranger stories too. One letter from a trader in South Carolina, dated 1726, tells of a deal made entirely in pigs and whiskey. A young man had gotten himself into debt after a failed attempt to grow indigo. Rather than face court or exile, he offered a local magistrate 2 pigs and 4 jugs of rum in return for forgiving the remainder of his owed taxes. The letter doesn't say whether the magistrate agreed, but local stories claim he took the pigs, poured the rum into a barrel, and hosted a feast that same week to clear the debt from his conscience. The implication was clear. Some debts were paid not with silence, but with celebration. And then there were the cautionary tales, trades made in desperation. In New York's Hudson River Valley, a young widow named Catherine Muller once traded her family's last musket, a finely made Dutch piece, for 2 sacks of wheat and a pair of winter boots. Her neighbors were stunned. Without the musket, she and her sons had no way to hunt. But Catherine was practical. Winter was already biting at the edges of her home. The boys needed food and warmth now, not game later. That spring, a neighbor gave her a broken musket from the attic to repair. It was never as good, never as reliable, but Catherine said it was enough, and she never apologized for the trade. In that moment, value wasn't about market worth. It was about timing, survival. The present, some trades were made with humor, like the infamous case in a coastal Rhode Island village, where a tavern keeper reportedly paid his bar tab with a live goat, which he tied outside the establishment and named ale debt. Goat became a local fixture, fed by customers, walked by children, and eventually claimed by the innkeeper himself when the tavern burned down years later. That goat, some said, was the only debt that ever truly paid for itself. Other exchanges were heavy with emotion. In one remote Maine settlement, a man offered his mother's wedding ring in return for a surgeon's time to remove an arrow from his brother's thigh after a hunting accident. The surgeon refused to accept it. He patched the boy's leg anyway and gave the ring back, but the man insisted the ring had to be traded, that something must be given. So instead, he returned days later with a fresh-caught halibut, a basket of apples, and a stitched leather pouch he'd made by hand. This time, the surgeon accepted. These were the rhythms of colonial money, not the jangle of coins, but the whisper of barter, the soft click of trade, the creak of cartwheels delivering firewood in exchange for milk. It was unpredictable, imperfect, messy, but it was also deeply personal. It kept villages alive. It kept neighbors in conversation. And it gave rise to a kind of economy that functioned not because of law, but because of shared need and the grace of patience. As time marched forward and the colonies grew, this delicate web would strain under the weight of population, trade expansion, and foreign influence. Commodities would be weighed against minted silver. Promises would no longer be enough, and the distant ring of real currency would soon echo down the muddy streets. But for a time, a long, dusty, candlelit time, this was money. Not printed, not perfect, but human. Long before colonists crossed the Atlantic with their barrels of rum and brass buttons, another economy had already taken root in the soil of the continent. One older, more symbolic, and deeply interwoven with ceremony, memory, and trust. Let us step softly into that world. We're no longer on a village street lined with thatched roofs and British flags. Now we're walking a forest path bordered by tall oaks and the slow curl of river mist. The breeze carries the scent of pine. The leaves underfoot are soft and wet. And ahead, there is a small clearing where 2 groups of people gather around a fire. Their voices low and deliberate. One side speaks in the rhythm of the Haudenosaunee, the other in the dialect of the Dutch. Between them is no table, no paper, no quill to scratch out a treaty. Instead, there is a belt, a long woven belt, made of tiny white and purple shell beads, arranged in precise patterns. Some lines run parallel, Others curve gently or form repeating shapes. The belt is not just decoration. It is the treaty, the agreement, the story. This is wampum, not merely money in the sense of currency, but memory incarnate. Wampum belts were sacred to many indigenous peoples, particularly those of the eastern woodlands, the Haudenosaunee, Iroquois, Lenape, and Algonquian tribes, among others, made from the polished shells of quahog clams, purple and whelks, white. Each bead was painstakingly shaped and drilled, then woven into strands using sinew or plant fiber. But more than art, more than jewelry, wampum was record, oral tradition encoded in beadwork, history, law, and treaty, made visible, wearable, repeatable. A belt might mark the peace between two nations. Another might tell the story of an ancestral journey. Others were used in council meetings, handed over as a pledge of sincerity, or exchanged to honor a marriage, a war alliance, or even a death. Wampum wasn't produced in great volumes, at least, not initially. Each bead carried the weight of work, meaning, and sacred time. To the indigenous people who used them, the value of wampum wasn't in its rarity, but in its story and the relationship it represented. And then, the Europeans arrived. The Dutch were the first to truly recognize wampum's potential as a trading tool, not because they understood its meaning, but because they saw its power. In the early 1600s, Dutch traders operating out of New Amsterdam, now New York, began to use wampum in exchanges with the local tribes, first for furs, then for land, then for other goods. What began as a gesture of diplomacy quickly turned into commerce. To the Dutch, the beads were beautiful and strange, portable, colorful, easily counted, and clearly valued by the people they were trading with. They saw a kind of currency, and like all colonizers with eyes on profit, they asked themselves, how can we scale this? Soon, Dutch settlers began mass-producing wampum, setting up workshops with metal drills to speed the bead-making process. Where it once took hours to create a single bead by hand with stone tools, now hundreds could be made in a day. They flooded the markets, used wampum to buy furs, food, land, and labor, and from there, wampum spilled into the rest of the colonies. The English adopted it in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Even court fines and taxes could briefly be paid in wampum in the early 1600s. To the colonists, wampum was becoming coin, something with an agreed-upon market value. But to indigenous communities, it was still language, a relational object with spiritual weight. This disconnect would grow, and it would have consequences. As colonists expanded their control, the wampum economy began to suffer from overuse and exploitation. Mass production eroded its perceived value. The quality of beads declined. The sacredness of the object faded in colonial hands, becoming more transactional, more mechanical. Some colonial authorities even minted exchange rates, stating that so many white beads equaled a penny, so many purple beads equaled a shilling. What had once been ceremonial became converted into ledger lines. For indigenous groups, this shift was both confusing and deeply insulting. Treaties encoded in wampum were being treated like pocket change. Sacred belts were exchanged without understanding their meaning. Waldeck. The colonists were misreading the entire system, trying to use a language of memory as a tool of commerce. By the late 1600s, the overproduction of wampum had caused it to collapse as a currency. In places like Massachusetts, it was officially phased out by law as legal tender. Traders returned to silver and tobacco. Wampum was discarded, or worse, collected and stored like trinkets. And yet, in indigenous communities, the belts remained. Not as money, but as memory. Some of those belts still exist today, carefully preserved in museums and tribal councils. They carry stories, not just of trade, but of heartbreak, of misunderstanding, of a currency misunderstood by the very people who tried to exploit it. Wampum didn't die. It simply returned to its original purpose, as record, as witness, as a reminder. Let's walk now into a different sort of market, not one with wooden stalls or dusty barrels, but one formed on forest paths and river bends. It's early spring. The ice has just begun to melt from the edges of the Hudson River, and you can hear the drip of thawing snow from branches above. You're standing near a long birch canoe, recently pulled ashore. Across from you is a man wrapped in a deerskin mantle, decorated with carved bone and beads. His eyes are sharp, his face unreadable. You are a colonial trader. He is a Lenape diplomat. And you both want something the other has. This is something more delicate, more fraught. You are standing on the thin line between two civilizations, trying to negotiate not just goods, but trust. Every word is measured, every gesture observed. And wampum, that sacred shell beadwork, lies between you, offered as both pledge and proposal. Such was the reality of indigenous settler trade in early America. It was never as simple as this for that. It was relationship first, diplomatic, often ceremonial. Before the furs and iron pots and gunpowder ever changed hands, there was smoking of pipes, exchange of greetings, and frequently the presentation of wampum belts, each strand a symbolic representation of the proposed alliance or agreement. For indigenous nations, trade was an extension of kinship. Relationships were forged over time, sometimes through marriages, sometimes through ritual, and often through repeated acts of gift-giving, not haggling. To give without immediate expectation of return was a sign of generosity, power, and good faith. And those who gave more than they received were seen not as fools, but as leaders. This clashed with European sensibilities. Colonists, raised on fixed prices and ledgers, often misunderstood these acts. They saw gift-giving as weakness, or as a transaction to be repaid quickly and precisely. But to their indigenous partners, such an attitude was offensive, an erasure of the honor that trade required. When things went well, trade flourished. The fur trade, in particular, became the backbone of many colonial economies. Beaver pelts, prized for their density and waterproof quality, were shipped back to Europe by the thousands to be turned into fashionable hats. In return, tribes received tools, weapons, cloth, beads, kettles, and even tobacco. In these exchanges, wampum often served as a middle ground, both diplomatic currency and a bridge of meaning. It marked serious intent and bound agreements. A belt given in sincerity might seal a land agreement or confirm the terms of safe passage. But when the belts were ignored or misused, relationships soured quickly. One Iroquois leader is recorded as saying to an English official, "You have thrown our belts behind your back," meaning that the colonial government had broken a promise that had been sealed in wampum, a violation not just of politics, but of spirit. To fully understand the difference between colonial and indigenous views of currency, you must understand this. For settlers, money was a means to an end, a way to secure goods, assert wealth, or settle debt. But for many native peoples, objects like wampum were symbols of spirit. They weren't simply beads. They were words made visible, promises, prayers, threads of ancestry. A belt woven to mark a peace agreement might be handled only in sacred ceremony. It could be touched only by the one who spoke for the people. Each pattern carried meaning. This line represented land boundaries, that one an oath of mutual defense, another a recognition of shared ancestry or mourning. To misuse such a belt, to sell it, melt it down, or repurpose it as casual decoration, was like tearing up scripture or burning a sacred relic. And yet, that's precisely what many colonists did. By the late 17th century, colonial governments and merchants increasingly began to treat wampum as simple currency, useful for paying debts, hiring laborers, or buying supplies. Wampum became just another item in the ledger, another line to be balanced, and when its value dipped, it was discarded. This devaluation caused not just economic problems, but cultural injury. Indigenous communities watched as their sacred objects were hoarded, counterfeited, or melted into coinage. It was more than disrespect. It was erasure. Yet still, the belts endured, because in indigenous memory, the beads weren't forgotten. They lived on, in story, in ceremony, in the quiet spaces where language didn't need paper or law to bind it. where memory itself was sacred, and a strand of beads could carry a treaty farther than any ship. Picture a single bead, small, smooth, oval. Its purple hue is deep, almost black, polished to a gentle sheen. Now imagine that bead being passed from hand to hand, from an Onondaga elder to a Dutch trader, from a Dutch trader to a fur trapper, from the trapper to a ship's captain, then tucked away in a crate bound for Europe, its meaning forgotten, but its shimmer intact. This is what happened to wampum. What was once sacred became saturated over the course of just a few decades. Colonists began producing wampum, not as a cultural artifact, but as a mass commodity. Workshops along the Long Island Sound, staffed by Dutch and later English craftsmen, began drilling thousands of beads a day, far more than any one indigenous community could produce by hand. Metal tools, spinning wheels, and water-powered lathes replaced the slow work of stone scraping and hollow bone drills. What once took hours could now be finished in minutes. The beads, once imbued with stories and effort, were now churned out by the hundreds, bundled into sacks, and traded by the inch. Colonial officials tried to impose standards. Laws were passed that dictated acceptable bead sizes, lengths, and even color preferences. Purple beads, being rarer in nature, were often valued at twice the rate of white ones. But even this was soon gamed. Some traders dyed inferior beads to pass them off as more valuable. Others cut corners, producing poorly shaped, brittle wampum that wouldn't survive even a single trade. Counterfeits began to circulate. As with any currency, once trust falters, collapse follows close behind. By the 1660s, murmurs of wampum's declining value were being heard across the colonies. In towns like New Haven and Boston, shopkeepers began refusing it outright. Some courts stopped accepting it as legal payment for fines or debts. Governors issued proclamations to tighten regulations, but the damage was already done. The overproduction of wampum had rendered it nearly worthless in commercial exchange, not because its material had changed, but because its meaning had been stripped away. It was no longer an artifact of diplomacy. It had become another object to be bought, sold, and discarded, like a bent spoon or a torn pouch. And yet, even as colonists grew disillusioned with wampum as currency, many still wore it. It adorned coats, hats, and belts, not for trade, but for vanity. Shell beads became accessories, their sacred patterns used as decoration in parlor rooms, church robes, and fashion pieces. The stories were gone. What remained was a shimmer and silence. Some belts were sold at auctions. Others were taken as war trophies. A few were donated to museums, but most were simply forgotten or destroyed. And yet, for those who remembered, wampum still pulsed with meaning. In indigenous communities, wampum belts continued to be used well into the 1800s and beyond. They were held not for profit, but for ceremony, brought out during funerals, naming rituals, seasonal councils, and treaty renewals. Some were stored in longhouses and passed from chief to chief, their meaning protected not by law, but by oral tradition. In these places, wampum never lost its voice. There's a quiet tragedy in the story of wampum, not just in its misuse, but in the misunderstanding that underpinned it. Colonists saw beads, indigenous people saw language. The settlers wanted exchange, the tribes wanted relationship. What was meant to signify alliance became reduced to weight and color. What had once held ancestral memory was melted into markets, stripped of spirit and bent toward profit. Wampum didn't fail as currency because it was flawed. It failed because it was never meant to serve that role outside its cultural ecosystem. It was taken out of context, mass-produced, and flattened until nothing remained but surface. And yet, something about it lingered. Even in its broken form, wampum reminded people, both settlers and tribes, that not all value can be weighed, not all promises can be printed, not all trade is just about goods. Some of it is about who we are to one another. As wampum faded from the hands of traders and shopkeepers, a new sound began to take its place, faint at first, like wind rattling a pouch. The sound of metal, of coins dropped into wooden drawers, of foreign silver clinking on a counter, of a weight in the pocket that felt less like memory and more like certainty. These were not British coins. Not yet. In fact, many colonists could go years, even decades, without ever seeing an English shilling. The Crown, for reasons both strategic and miserly, refused to supply the colonies with adequate coinage. They feared colonial wealth would lead to colonial independence, so they kept the minting tight. But economies don't wait for permission, so colonists turned to what was available, and what was most available was Spanish. Spanish silver dollars, also known as pieces of 8, became the most widely used coinage in early America, not because the colonies minted them, but because trade with the Caribbean and Central America brought them ashore in waves. These coins were round, heavy, and dependable. Their silver content was trusted, their weight recognized across oceans. Traders from Boston to Charleston accepted them as easily as any British coin, often more so. Even colonial governments begrudgingly began to quote prices and taxes in Spanish currency. It was a strange arrangement. British colonies built on Spanish silver. Some merchants even began cutting the coins into smaller pieces, bits, so that they could make change. 2 bits, where the old phrase comes from. 2 bits equaled a quarter of a dollar, a slice of silver, a portion of something whole. Over time, colonial life adjusted to this imported currency. It wasn't native, and it wasn't sentimental, but it was reliable. It held its value. And in a world where trust was beginning to fray, that mattered more than anything. For those who remembered the days of barter and wampum, the new silver standard felt cold, unforgiving. Coins had no face, no name. They didn't remember your father's deeds or your grandmother's cooking. They couldn't be bent into belts or gifted with a prayer. They just were, fixed, impersonal, but they also made life easier, more predictable. A loaf of bread cost a coin, not a story. A pair of boots cost 6 bits, not 2 chickens. A jar of butter, and a promise to help with the harvest. Some people missed the flexibility of the old ways, the haggling, the gift-giving, the human dance of trade. Others embraced the crisp logic of coinage. It divided people not just by wealth, but by mentality. And through it all, Indigenous communities watched with wary eyes, because even as wampum was being pushed aside, silver did not replace it in their world. Few tribes adopted coinage in the same way. They continued to trade, furs, goods, services, but the symbolic relationships that once defined diplomacy grew more strained. Coins were harder to read. They said nothing, promised nothing. They meant nothing beyond what a stranger claimed they were worth. And in many cases, they became tools of dispossession. Land was bought with silver. Silver that could not be eaten, planted, worn, or understood in the same way as a strand of shells or a belt of beads. The new economy had arrived, but it had left much behind. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, coinage was taking root across the colonies. Wampum was still used in some places, particularly rural markets, or between settlers and indigenous traders who had retained older relationships. But its days were numbered. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, once a proud user of wampum, passed laws limiting its use. Merchants began printing ledgers with prices in pounds, shillings, and pence. And while silver coins still weren't minted locally, their presence was felt in every corner store, tavern, and port. Still, there was an awkwardness to it. The loads were foreign. There were too few. Their values fluctuated depending on where they came from. Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French. One man's 8-real coin might be valued higher than another's, depending on the mint mark. Some merchants refused certain coins. Others shaved slivers off the edge, a practice called clipping, to cheat just a bit of silver from every transaction. This wasn't quite the golden age of hard currency. It was more like a slow, hesitant shuffle towards something more consistent. The colonies weren't ready to mint their own coins, at least not openly. But the desire was growing, and under the floorboards, in back rooms, and deep in the minds of restless colonists, a new idea began to form. What if we made our own money? It's easy to think of money as inevitable, as something governments simply produce a basic function, like air in the lungs or water through pipes. But in colonial America, coinage was anything but automatic. In fact, it was withheld, intentionally, strategically, quietly. The British Crown, for all its pomp and power, had no interest in flooding its North American colonies with silver and gold. That might seem strange at first. Weren't colonies meant to be prosperous, productive, loyal? Yes, but not too prosperous. From the British perspective, wealth in the colonies was a dangerous thing. Too much coin meant too much independence. It might lead merchants to operate outside the Crown's reach. It might allow towns to fund their own defenses, their own courts, their own rebellions. Better, they thought, to keep the purse strings tight. So they did. The colonies were expected to ship raw goods, tobacco, sugar, lumber, rice, furs, back to England. In return, they received finished products, cloth, tools, ceramics, books. But what they didn't receive, in any great quantity, was coinage. There were some English coins in circulation, copper farthings, silver shillings, the occasional guinea, but they were in short supply, and often the best pieces were hoarded by the wealthy, kept in boxes and pouches as quiet trophies of status. For ordinary colonists, the shelves of coinage were bare. They improvised, they bartered, they used tobacco, muskrat pelts, nails. They leaned on wampum and IOUs, and increasingly they turned to foreign coins, particularly those from Spain. But deep beneath it all, a quiet frustration began to grow. Why should the colonies rely on coins stamped with another king's face? Why should Boston's markets run on Madrid's mint? Why, when every corner of colonial life was being taxed and ruled from afar, should even money be a gift from someone else? That question, whispered in taverns, muttered in counting houses, would soon lead to something quietly revolutionary. But before we get there, let's listen to the coins that did arrive. Spanish silver dollars, the famed pieces of 8, were more than just convenient. They were everywhere. Minted in Spanish colonies, from silver mined in the mountains of Peru and Mexico, these coins were among the most widely used in the world. Each one was a small disc of promise, heavy, pure, and internationally recognized. They bore the image of the Spanish king on one side, and the Pillars of Hercules on the other, a design so iconic it would later inspire the dollar sign. To American colonists, they were a godsend. In markets from Savannah to Salem, a Spanish dollar could buy cloth, flour, salt, shoes, even land. They were trusted because of their consistent silver content, around 27 grams of 0.93 fine silver, and because they were accepted far beyond the colonies. A merchant could sail from New York to Barbados and pay the same price with the same coin. No colonial mint, no British law, no royal permission, just value. These coins were so embedded in colonial life that even after the American Revolution, the fledgling U.S. continued to use them. In fact, the term dollar comes directly from these Spanish coins. But there was still a problem. Not everyone wanted to rely on Spain forever. And with the British refusing to mint coins locally, some colonies began to take matters into their own hands, quietly, carefully, and not entirely legally. Let us drift now to Massachusetts Bay in the year 1652. The Puritan colony is still young, barely 3 decades old, but it hums with industry. Sawmills turn, carts clatter down dirt roads. The town square bustles with traders. Yet underneath the rhythms of daily life, there is a lingering problem. There is no reliable currency. The Spanish silver is there, sometimes. Wampum still flickers on the edges of trade, but merchants, farmers and laborers alike, are tired of conversion tables and clipped coins. They want something their own, a stable, local currency for a colony that is growing restless. And so, in a quiet act of defiance cloaked as practicality, the Massachusetts General Court grants permission for a mint to be established. No permission from the Crown, no charter from London, just a decision, made by colonists, for colonists to print their own money. The mint is set up in Boston, and the man chosen to oversee it is John Hull, a silversmith of good reputation. His task is simple in design, but radical in implication. Take silver, often Spanish pieces of 8, melt it down, and recast it into distinctly Massachusetts coins. The most iconic of these coins bore a familiar symbol. Not a king's head, but a tree. At first it was an oak, then a willow, and finally, the one that would endure, the pine tree shilling. The design was simple. One side showed a tall pine, its branches reaching skyward, a nod to the trees that lined the colony's forests and fed its shipyards. The other bore the words Massachusetts and the date. Every coin from that mint, whether struck in 1660 or 1674, still bore that same date. Why? Because 1652 was the final year England was without a monarch during the interregnum, after the execution of Charles I and before the rise of Charles II. By using that date, Massachusetts avoided the appearance of minting under royal rule. It was a clever loophole, a frozen moment in time, used to justify years of quiet defiance. It was colonial coinage, local, elegant, and deeply political. To understand the pine tree shilling is to understand the restlessness of the colonies, the slow, patient burn of a people who were still loyal to Britain in word, but increasingly independent in action. The coin became more than a medium of exchange. It became a symbol. It stood for self-reliance, for the ability to forge a local economy with local tools. It represented the forests that fed New England's ships, the silver that came not from England, but from trade and ingenuity, and the quiet confidence of a colony that no longer wanted to beg for permission. It also caused trouble. Word of the mint eventually reached London. The idea that Massachusetts was striking its own coins, royal likeness or not, was alarming. Such independence was not encouraged. In 1684, the Crown revoked the colony's charter. Within a few years, the mint was closed. But the damage, from Britain's point of view, had already been done. The idea of local money had taken root. The pine tree had been planted, not just in silver, but in the minds of colonists who were beginning to see themselves not just as subjects, but as citizens. The coin presses have slowed. Pine trees have stopped growing. The Massachusetts Mint has been silenced by royal decree, but the need for currency, real or otherwise, still pulses through every port, farm, and market stall. And when supply dries up, imitation follows. So let us step now not into the warmth of a colonial tavern or the light of a lawful mint, but into the cellar of a crooked craftsman, where silver clinks not with honor, but with mischief. Here in the dim light, you might find a pair of hands holding a worn mold. Melted silver, sometimes real, sometimes debased, pours into the cast. The cooling coin is removed, polished, and clipped to just the right size. From a distance, it gleams. It passes in the dark. It lives in a purse, no different than the rest. This was the world of colonial counterfeiters. Men, and sometimes women, who made their own money, not with permission, but with skill and nerve. Counterfeiting was widespread in colonial America. It was a crime, harshly punished when discovered, but it was also strangely common, often carried out by people with few other options. For some, it was survival. For others, it was opportunity. The process was surprisingly sophisticated. Forgers learned to mimic the weight and stamp of coins like the Spanish dollar, the Dutch lion daalder, or the old pine tree shillings. Some clipped edges from real coins to melt and stretch into new ones. Others used base metals, pewter, lead, brass, and plated them in silver so they'd pass muster under low light. Markets and taverns became testing grounds. If a forged coin lasted through a single exchange, it might change hands a dozen times before being discovered, and by then the forger was long gone. Some counterfeiters were caught. In 1705, a Boston man was sentenced to public whipping and imprisonment after being found with a press and a stash of fake halfpennies. In New York, a woman named Anne Rogers was jailed for distributing bad Spanish coins laced with iron filings. In Pennsylvania, entire gangs operated in secret, striking coins and laundering them through backwater stores and taverns. But for every forger caught, another seemed to appear. The shortage of real money made the forgers into something more than just criminals. They were, in a strange way, suppliers. Dangerous, yes. Illegal, yes. But in a system built on scarcity, they were also part of the ecosystem. The colonies, of course, didn't take this lightly. Governors issued proclamations. Rewards were offered for the capture of known counterfeiters. Public punishments were severe: floggings, branding, even the occasional execution. Newspapers printed warnings. Merchants were encouraged to weigh coins, bite them, check edges for tampering. Some shops refused certain coins entirely. Others posted small notices above their counters, listing the coins they accepted and which ones they believed were being forged. But it wasn't easy. Without a central bank or official mint, no single standard existed. Even real coins varied in size, weight, and appearance depending on their origin. A perfectly legal Dutch coin might resemble a forgery from across the river. This uncertainty gave counterfeiters space to operate, and many took full advantage. Still, there were moments of clever resistance. Some colonies tried issuing their own counterfeit tokens. Small, locally minted coins stamped with unique designs, or markings meant to be hard to fake. Others began recoining damaged or suspicious coins by melting and recasting them under strict supervision. And in some towns, informal networks of merchants banded together to inspect suspicious currency, warning each other of new forgeries in circulation. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a beginning. But even as colonies pushed back, the damage to trust was deep. In a barter economy, trade relied on relationships. In a coin economy, it relied on confidence, in weight, purity, and honesty. Every forged coin was a betrayal of that trust. People grew suspicious. Some hoarded only foreign silver. Others buried their savings, literally, hiding coins in cellars, tree stumps, and under floorboards. A few returned to the old ways, bartering goods, or writing promissory notes rather than risk accepting a bad coin. The very idea of money became unstable. If you couldn't trust a coin, could you trust anything? This question lingered in the air like smoke. It hovered over every market deal, every tavern exchange. And while the Crown and colonial officials tried to impose order, the colonies continued to drift, not just economically, but emotionally, away from the systems that were meant to hold them. The counterfeit coin, in its small glittering treachery, became a symbol of something bigger. The colonies didn't just lack coins, they lacked control. And that longing for autonomy, for self-determination, for an economy of their own, would soon push them beyond counterfeiting into revolution. Let us leave behind the courtroom and the counterfeiter's cellar. Let us return to the coin itself. A simple, round disc of silver, smooth at the edges, slightly worn. A Spanish real, perhaps, or a pine tree shilling, now rubbed so thin that the branches are barely visible. It does not speak, but if it could, what stories it might tell. Because coins, like people, have journeys. And in colonial America, a single coin might pass through hundreds of hands, touching lives so different, yet bound together by its shimmer. Imagine it begins with a sea captain, his hands cracked from salt, his coat still damp from a storm off the Carolinas. He stands at a dockside counting house in Boston, settling payment for barrels of sugar offloaded at dawn. Among the stack of papers and ledgers sits a small purse. Inside it, 8 Spanish silver dollars. He tucks one into his vest and walks off into the crowd. Hours later, he steps into a tavern. The fire is low, the floor muddy. He slaps the coin onto the bar and asks for a bowl of stew and a night's lodging upstairs. The innkeeper nods. He pockets the coin without much thought. The stew is warm. The coin is colder. The next morning, that same coin is given to a blacksmith in payment for shoeing the tavern's old mare, who nearly threw a wheel the night before. The blacksmith adds the coin to a small pile in his tool chest. He doesn't trust banks. He trusts fire. A week later, the blacksmith gives the coin to his neighbor, a widow who knits woolen mittens and sells them door to door. Winter is coming. His daughter's hands are bare. The widow takes the coin, folds it into a piece of linen, and walks on. That night, the coin is tucked beneath her mattress. Months pass. The coin travels again. This time, it's used to pay a schoolmaster for 2 months of reading lessons for a boy named Elijah. The teacher accepts the coin, knowing it will buy him candles and bread, and perhaps paper for copying out Latin verses. From there, it finds its way into the hands of a bookseller, then a merchant, then a midwife, who places it gently into a small wooden box next to a carved cross, and a dried posy. Some say coins carry energy, that they remember warmth and worry, that they never forget the hands that held them. In colonial America, that was almost certainly true, because money wasn't anonymous. It wasn't abstract. It was real, felt, weighed, examined by lamplight and candle glow. And each coin, each shilling or doubloon or bit, carried not just a value, but a trace of humanity, of the fears, the hopes, the bargains made in firelight. In the end, the story of coins in colonial America is not a story of metal alone. It is a story of people trying to find fairness in an unfair world, stability in a shifting one. Coins were tools, yes, but they were also signals. To trade a coin was to say, I believe this is worth something, and I believe you will honor that worth. That belief was tested, twisted, betrayed, and renewed again and again across decades and generations. And every time someone placed a coin into someone else's hand, they weren't just buying bread or wool or a place by the fire. They were taking part in something older than kings and parliaments, a quiet agreement. I will give you this, you will give me that, and between us there will be trust. Even when the money was foreign, even when it was counterfeit, even when it bore no face they recognized. That was the heartbeat of the colonial economy. Not silver or shells, but faith. Faith that the next hand would be honest, that the next trade would be fair. That value, however fragile, could still be shared. Close your eyes for a moment. Listen, not for the metallic chime of coins, but for the faint scratch of a quill on parchment. Fire crackles nearby. The fire crackles nearby. The clerk leans over a desk, candlelight flickering in his inkpot. He's writing something not for a journal or a letter, but for trade. A promise, a note, a small slip of paper with no silver, no seal, no portrait, just ink and belief. Welcome to the era of colonial paper money. The idea of using paper instead of metal for money was not new. The Chinese had done it centuries earlier, but in the British colonies of North America, the move to paper began not as a grand innovation, but as a last resort. The problem was simple. There still weren't enough coins. Barter, foreign silver, and colonial tokens had all played their part. But as wars flared and trade expanded, the colonies simply needed more liquidity, more spendable currency, and they weren't getting it from England. So, starting in 1690, the colony of Massachusetts did something unprecedented. It printed its own paper money, not vouchers, not receipts, but actual bills of credit, backed not by gold or silver, but by the promise that the colonial government would accept them later, usually for taxes. Other colonies quickly followed. Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. The idea spread not because it was perfect, but because it worked, at least temporarily. These early notes came in all sizes and designs. Some were elaborately printed, others handwritten. Most were backed by nothing but trust. Trust that the colony wouldn't print too many, that merchants would accept them, and that in time they could be redeemed. For a time, that trust held, but even before official paper money took root, promissory notes had been circulating like leaves in the wind. A promissory note was a kind of handwritten IOU, often made between individuals. It might say something like, I, William Hadley, do promise to pay Thomas Reed the sum of £2 sterling, or its equal value in goods, on or before the 10th of October, 1724. No banks, no interest, just words and hope. These notes were portable, transferable, and in some towns, they passed from hand to hand like cash, so long as the person whose name was written at the top could be trusted to repay. It was money made of character. A wealthy man's note might circulate for months. A poor man's might be refused at the first offer. In that way, paper money wasn't just about the economy. It was about reputation, about names and faces, and how long they'd been in town. In a society where printing was expensive and metal scarce, promises became the primary currency, written on parchment, carried in pockets, pinned to shutters, folded into Bibles. Sometimes they were paid, sometimes they weren't, And as the economy swelled with handwritten paper, formal and informal, it became harder and harder to tell what a pound truly meant. Despite the usefulness of paper money, many colonists distrusted it deeply. Coins, after all, had weight. They rang when dropped. They could be tested, measured, stored. They had substance. Paper. It could be forged. It could burn. It could fade in the rain or vanish in a fire. Worse, its value was abstract. It was only worth something because people said it was. And people, as colonial history had shown, were not always reliable. Merchants often preferred to be paid in silver or gold, especially those who traded with Europe. Farmers might accept paper bills locally, but if they needed to buy imported tools or pay off a British creditor, paper wouldn't do. Some even refused it outright. Others, more pragmatic, took paper at a discount. A 10-pound note might only be accepted for 8 pounds worth of goods, simply because no one knew if it would hold its value. Even churches sometimes refused offerings in paper form, preferring coins that wouldn't lose worth before the next tithe. And beneath all this suspicion loomed a larger fear. What if the government printed too much? That question, quiet at first, would soon roar to life. Because as more colonies printed more paper to pay for wars, roads, and salaries, the balance between trust and inflation began to tilt. And in time, it would break. By the early 1700s, most of the American colonies had joined the great monetary experiment, printing their own paper money. These weren't private notes between neighbors anymore. They were official issues, printed by colonial governments, signed by treasurers, and meant to be used just like coins. They came with promises, not of silver waiting in a vault, but of future tax revenue, or redemption after a certain number of years. But while the intention was practical, the execution was uneven. Each colony printed its own notes. Each set different denominations. Each used different backing. A 5-pound note in Pennsylvania wasn't the same as a 5-pound note in Connecticut, and neither was equivalent to actual sterling. There was no central authority, no unifying standard. It was, in many ways, an economy stitched together from scraps. Massachusetts was first, issuing its paper to fund a failed military expedition against Quebec. The notes weren't backed by coin, and when the troops returned unpaid, trust in the money began to falter. Rhode Island followed, printing notes to pay off debts and stimulate local trade, but they issued too many, too quickly. By the 1720s, Rhode Island bills were worth far less than their face value. In South Carolina, the problem was even stranger. The colony issued massive quantities of paper money to finance land purchases and entice settlers. In some cases, colonists used the very paper given to them by the government to buy land from the government, creating a surreal loop where the colony paid itself with promises. At first, paper made commerce easier. Small farmers, for the first time, had access to liquidity. Local debts could be paid without hard silver. Markets buzzed with exchange. Roads were built, bridges repaired. But over time, the problems grew louder than the progress. Here's the danger with paper money. You can always print more. And once the colonies discovered this, many couldn't resist. To cover shortfalls in taxes, they printed. To finance wars, they printed. To stimulate trade during downturns, they printed. To pay soldiers, repair ports, fund assemblies, and subsidize merchants, they printed. And as they printed, the value of each individual note began to shrink. Inflation crept in slowly at first, like a stain spreading across fabric. A loaf of bread that once cost 1 note now cost 2. A yard of cloth that once sold for 10 shillings was suddenly 12, then 15. People grew uneasy. Would the paper I hold today still be worth anything tomorrow? The trust that made paper money possible began to erode, and as trust crumbled, more and more people refused to accept the bills unless they were paid in higher amounts. A kind of unofficial exchange rate adjustment, done by merchants and tradesmen on the fly. This created regional panic. Colonies accused one another of destabilizing the shared economy. New York merchants refused Rhode Island bills. Pennsylvania tradesmen mocked New Jersey currency as play notes. And across the board, people began demanding hard coin wherever they could get it. But coin, as ever, remained scarce. So what remained was chaos. a storm of paper flying from hand to hand, with everyone pretending to believe in its value just long enough to trade it for something real. By the mid-1700s, the situation had worsened. In New England, inflation was so bad that colonial governments began recalling their notes, offering to replace them with new paper in a different color or design, a visual reset to try to restore confidence. But the public, increasingly skeptical, wasn't convinced. Some people hoarded goods instead of money. Others fled rural markets and relied once again on barter, swapping candles for butter, bread for labor, returning to the old rhythms they had only just begun to move beyond. And still, the paper piled up. There was no centralized bank to control the money supply, no national currency, just a dozen colonies, each acting alone, each hoping the next issue of notes would be better than the last. But the truth was clear. The paper could only float as long as people believed in it. And belief, especially in uncertain times, was a fragile thing. When printed money failed, when coins vanished and paper bills fluttered toward worthlessness, colonists often turned back to something older, something quieter, something made not by governments, but by hand and heart. They returned to the promissory note. These were slips of parchment or rough paper, folded into ledgers, tucked into aprons, passed discreetly from one person to another. Some were barely more than a sentence. Others were formal contracts, copied from legal books and sealed with wax. But they all carried the same message. You may not have silver, you may not have gold, but I trust that you will pay. Promissory notes were the human version of money. You weren't trusting the government. You were trusting Elias, who ran the tannery on the edge of town, or Rachel, who sold molasses by the keg and kept careful records in her ledger. You trusted that they would honor their word, and you wrote that trust down. I promised to deliver 6 barrels of salted fish before Michaelmas, in exchange for 20 pounds of tobacco. Signed, Tobias Claggett, 1721. These notes functioned as portable credit. A farmer might use one to buy seed in spring, promising payment after harvest. A merchant might offer one in place of coin while awaiting the arrival of a cargo ship. A widow might use one to secure firewood from a neighbor, repaying in pies and preserves as the year allowed. Some notes had interest, others had fixed dates, but most were simple, flexible, and understood by everyone involved. In a world where formal banking systems barely existed, these handwritten agreements carried economies forward. Beyond towns and fields, a more formal version of the promissory note existed in merchant circles, known as the Bill of Exchange. This was the lifeblood of transatlantic commerce. Or, it allowed colonial traders to conduct business with partners in London, Lisbon, or the West Indies, without exchanging hard coin. A bill of exchange might be written in Boston, payable in London, and endorsed 3 times before it ever reached its final destination. It worked like this. A Boston merchant buys a shipment of sugar from Jamaica. He doesn't pay in coin. Instead, he writes a bill of exchange, a formal promise that a partner in London will pay the Jamaican merchant on his behalf. That partner receives the bill, honors it, and deducts the amount from the Boston merchant's account. In theory, no money moves, only trust. But for this to work, the reputation of everyone involved had to be sterling. One broken bill, one unpaid debt, and an entire web of trade might unravel, because a bill of exchange wasn't just paper, it was a chain of honor. What made these documents so powerful and so fragile was that they lived or died by the character of those who signed them. In small towns, a man's name could be as good as a vault of silver or worth nothing at all. A note from a respected elder might circulate freely as payment. One from a drifter might be refused before the ink dried. Reputation was currency. This wasn't always fair. The poor, the new arrivals, the women working without a husband's name on the document, they often struggled to have their notes accepted. But even so, this human credit system allowed thousands of colonists to trade, build, survive, even thrive without touching a single coin. And when colonial paper currency collapsed, bloated by inflation and distrust, these handwritten promises sometimes held on longer, because while a government might default, a neighbor might not. The trouble with promises is that, eventually, someone wants to collect. By the mid-1700s, the American colonies had created a paper-based economy almost entirely built on trust. But that trust was under strain, and war would push it past the breaking point. Colonial paper money, as fragile as it was, had survived day-to-day use. But war demanded more than daily bread. It demanded armies, supplies, ships, and speed. And with coins still scarce, colonies turned once again to their printing presses. When the French and Indian War broke out in the 1750s, colonies began printing currency at unprecedented rates to finance military operations. Troops had to be fed, weapons purchased, forts built, and each new note that passed into circulation, unbacked by gold or silver, diluted the value of those already in people's hands. It happened quietly at first. One loaf of bread rose by a few pence, then a bushel of wheat, then rent, then wages. All by the end of the war, prices had climbed so high that many merchants refused all paper notes from certain colonies. No matter how official, people panicked. Some stopped accepting paper altogether. Others rushed to exchange it for goods before it lost more value. Wealth vanished overnight. A savings of £100 in currency might buy what £20 had bought a year earlier. Inflation became the invisible fire, and in its smoke, confidence burned. The colonies limped out of war, bruised and debt-ridden, and just as they tried to recover, the next storm began to gather. The American Revolution, to fight a war against the British Empire. With no central bank, no national treasury, and almost no coinage, the newly declared United States turned to the only option it had: more paper. The Continental Congress began issuing what came to be known as Continental dollars, paper bills designed to fund the revolution. But these notes, too, were unbacked by hard money, and they were issued in vast numbers, by the millions, printed in Philadelphia, signed by hand, and sent out with slogans like "Death to Counterfeiters." It wasn't long before inflation returned with a vengeance. By 1779, just 3 years after the Declaration of Independence, continental money had lost nearly all of its value. Merchants refused it. Soldiers who were paid in it sometimes deserted or rioted. Foreign governments laughed at it. Even Congress admitted it was worth not a continental, giving rise to the phrase we still use today. The result was financial chaos. In some towns, trade returned to barter. In others, people used foreign coin again: Spanish silver, Dutch guilders, Portuguese gold. In the midst of a war for liberty, America had no real money of its own, only a pile of broken promises, carried on crumbling parchment. And yet, from this chaos, something began to take shape. It was clear to everyone, from farmers in Connecticut to financiers in Philadelphia, that paper could not survive without structure. There needed to be a central authority, a standardized dollar, a limited supply, backed by real assets. Something new, something national. And so, after the Revolution, as the fledgling United States began to draft its Constitution, it included something radical: a single federal power over money. Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin. The days of each colony printing its own bills were over. Promises would no longer be made in 12 directions. There would be $1, one standard, one government to regulate its worth. In 1792, the United States officially adopted the dollar as its national currency, modeled, not coincidentally, on the Spanish piece of 8 that had kept the colonies afloat for so long. The first U.S. mint was established in Philadelphia. Real coins were struck. Slowly, trust returned. But it came at a cost. It came after panic, after inflation, after decades of barter, betrayal, and broken trust, after counterfeiters and war, after pine trees and shell beads and ink-stained notes passed hand to hand in hope and fear. America would finally have its own money, but it had taken a century and a revolution to get there. The sun is setting now over the village green. The stalls are being packed away. A barrel of apples rolls gently into shadow. The blacksmith douses his forge. A woman draws her shawl tight and turns for home. A loaf of bread tucked beneath her arm, traded, perhaps for a spool of thread, or a promise of kindling come winter. There is no jingle of coin here, no swipe of card, no digital ping, only the murmur of neighbors, the creak of cartwheels, the whisper of trust. You've walked now through more than 100 years of colonial history, not through wars or parades, but through pockets and ledgers, cellars and counters. You've heard the rustle of handwritten IOUs. You've watched a boy clutch a candle as he barters for a marble. You've followed a silver coin from hand to hand, across fields, across rivers, across generations. And through it all, one truth has flickered, constant and quiet. Money is not a thing. It's a belief. In colonial America, it took many forms. Tobacco leaves, shell beads, Spanish silver, a forged shilling, a debt scribbled in haste, a piece of parchment stamped with a pine tree, or a bill that claimed to be worth £5, even if no one believed it anymore. None of it meant anything without agreement, without the nod, the handshake, the silent understanding between buyer and seller, debtor and lender, farmer and widow. Without trust, a coin is just a lump of metal, a note is just ink on paper. But with trust, with shared belief, even a muskrat pelt or a smile can become currency. Tonight, perhaps, the paper money of the past seems primitive, but maybe it was no more fragile than what we use now. Numbers on a screen, backed by institutions we hope will hold. Maybe we are not so far from the colonists after all. We still assign value to things not because they are rare or heavy or printed by kings, but because we all agree to believe in the story that this has worth, that this is fair, that this will still mean something tomorrow. So the next time you hold a coin, or tap a card, or pass a folded bill to someone across a counter, remember the farmer trading garlic for boots, the silversmith stamping pine trees in defiance, the tribes weaving treaties into belts of shell, the paper that fluttered, inflated, faded, but kept trade alive. Remember that before all the systems and signatures, it was just people, trading what they had, trusting that someone else would see its worth, and quietly, keeping the world turning, one story of value at a time. Good night.